Global trade is changing quite a bit, and it's been happening for quite a while already, but it's really accelerating now because of the actions by the new United States administration. So the second Trump administration is an extremely protectionist one. It's one that has essentially ripped up the rules of the game in terms of multilateral trade. The United States has essentially increased its tariffs by what scientifically would be called an order of magnitude, so at least 10 times. So going from an average of 1.5% to 2% to 20% or even higher for some countries. Some countries are suddenly now confronted with a 50% import tariff in the United States. So clearly that is inducing firms to kind of say, well, where do I go? Can I still be competitive in the United States? Can I go to other markets? So there's a process ongoing of a reallocation of trade towards markets that are still more relatively open. But also, this is something that has been going on for longer, which is a desire by many firms to say, we need to diversify our sources of supply. So we come from a period of globalization where there was extreme specialization. And what we're seeing is that a lot of that trade is subject to either risks, climate risks, political risks, and also what we're seeing is that some countries are beginning to weaponize that dependence. So there's a reallocation pattern going on in terms of that sourcing of supplies, but also in terms of where do we sell our goods. Part of the reason we had this extreme trade specialization develop over the last 20, 30 years is because many countries liberalized their markets and they all participated in the World Trade Organization. So there was a multilateral trade regime, which essentially defined rules for countries with respect to the use of trade policy. What has happened in the last 10 years or so is that the United States has decided they don't like those rules anymore. They no longer want to live by those rules. And they've essentially taken actions which make it very much more difficult to enforce the rules. Now, the multilateral trading system, which is essentially the WTO, has not been able in the last 15 years or so to come to an agreement on new rules of the game with respect to trade policy. So one implication of that has been is that countries, because they couldn't negotiate new agreements in the WTO, they said, well, let's negotiate with countries that are important to us as markets so that we establish greater certainty for our firms. Right? And a lot of that has not much to do with liberalization because it was already quite open, but a lot of that has to do with regulatory requirements. What the WTO doesn't allow you to do is to say, let's make an agreement on a particular product, on steel. Right? And I'm going to give duty-free access to steel from a set of countries, but not to other countries. Right? So then we're discriminating. That implies discrimination. That's prohibited by the WTO. So what you can also do, and what has been done, is that a large group of countries says, okay, we're going to collectively agree. We reduce tariffs on pharmaceutical inputs, or we reduce tariffs on information technology products, and we apply that to everybody. So not every country needs to do this, but as long as there's what is called a critical mass of countries that see enough benefit to themselves in doing this, and then the rest of the world can free ride. And the third type of plurilateral agreement is one that is not necessarily about market access, about liberalization, but it's about regulatory cooperation, right? And we're seeing a lot of that happening around the world, where regulators are coming together and saying, well, we need to regulate the safety of a particular product. What is a good regulatory regime in order to achieve our objectives? And can we agree collectively that all of us are going to do something very much in the same direction, which is one, good to achieve regulatory outcomes, and two, it's good for trade. The EU is an interesting case in this whole complicated arena of plurilateral and multilateral cooperation. So the EU is very much a proponent of rule-based approaches to international relations, right? And that includes trade. So the EU is a big defender of the WTO, has been a very active participant in negotiating the rules. But the EU has also been a big proponent of plurilateral cooperation. And that's particularly reflected in trade agreements, right? So the EU has a wide network of preferential trade agreements with partner countries. So both developing countries, African, Caribbean, Pacific countries, but also with large trading partners. The EU has also been a player in terms of plurilateral cooperation on regulation, right? So international regulatory cooperation. And partly that's something which involves the member states, because the member states are still kind of in charge of a particular area. So it's not the EU as a union, but it's individual member states like Italy or Germany or the Netherlands who are sending regulators to kind of talk to each other with their counterparts abroad to think about international standardization. That's where the EU has played an important role. The one area in which the EU has not been active on the plurilateral front is in trying to negotiate agreements which deal with particular issues and which are not tied to trade agreements, which are not necessarily linked to the WTO. And what has happened in the last 10 years or so is that some countries have said, okay, it's going too slowly in the WTO. We need to do things amongst ourselves. We'll do that outside the WTO. We're not going to be a closed shop, right? We're very happy if other countries join us, but we really need to move faster in the area of, let's say, the digital economy, right? So there are, and the countries that are leading that process are in East Asia and the Pacific. A very interesting agreement that was just negotiated among New Zealand, Singapore, Switzerland, Iceland, right? And essentially what they're trying to do is to create a framework and to show the rest of the world that countries can actually agree on frameworks that fight climate change, using trade as an instrument, but at the same time not being protectionist. And that's where the EU is still very much missing in action. In the trade world, so I'm a trade economist, and I spent my whole life working on trade. So trade economists tend to think in terms of trade agreements. So these are formal agreements that are binding and enforceable. They're very elegant, they're very complicated. But as I just mentioned previously, there's a lot of other types of international cooperation which is aimed either directly or indirectly at facilitating trade, which don't necessarily have anything to do with a trade agreement, which is all about this complicated package of liberalization. What kind of design features should these agreements have in order to get all of us to agree on a particular regulatory approach, but also to enable me to recognize that what you are doing in that regulatory area is good enough. So this concept of mutual recognition of regulatory regimes is also something that is being done internationally, but that doesn't necessarily require a trade agreement. What it requires is regulators to actually understand each other's regimes and to recognize that they're all doing this similar things to achieve the same objective. So I think that's a big area of research that I'm personally involved in. And one of the questions is, to what extent do you need to have trade as an enforcement mechanism? Or is there another instrument that I can use to try and help you get back to what you wanted to do originally? Or if you have decided, no, we really need to do something else, that doesn't blow up our relationship across the board. It's a big agenda for research, and that's something which we're working on here at the Schuman Centre.